So, this is the second installment of the Poet Theater History of Infiltration. We're going to look at the 1700s. I was going to say 1790 to 1890, but that's too much. So, we're going to start with the 1790s, the late 1700s, you guys. That's when you had the Haitian Revolution, the American Revolution, and the French Revolution. And the reason all this stuff is happening at this time is because the bourgeoisie is ascendant. Now, everybody says the bourgeoisie, so let me clarify what I mean. I mean the professions and roles that were below the nobility of Europe from about 800 AD to 1500. These were the middle class, right? They were in between the peasantry, in between the slaves and the serfs, and below the king and the nobility. So these guys were merchants, lawyers, judges, bailiffs, right? Clergy, academics. And what happened is with trade during the Crusades, trade with the Middle East and the Islamic Caliphate and the Ottoman Empire, and indirectly China, what that did was it gave them more awareness, more learning, and gave them a sense of power against their own nobility. So the bourgeoisie was ascendant, and to ascend, they needed justification. So that's when you have all these bourgeois ideas. Now, at this time, the radical ideas were republicanism and democracy, especially. Because the idea was some of these educated bourgeois men could rule the country instead of the king and the nobility. And even worse or crazier was the idea that everybody in the nation, men, women, slaves, serf, Christian, Catholic, pagan, would have a right and have a say in what was going on in the country. So let's go to the timeline. We start in the 1790s. The big concern was the French Revolution, and conservatism starts from this time. Edmund Burke was a member of parliament, and he wrote basically what was going on in, let's see if I have it here. He said what was going on in France was horrible, and we needed to stop it from coming to England. And so that's when he started this idea that instead of radical change, you need slow, gradual change, which is the idea of modern Democrats and modern Republicans. So let's start here. 1790s, we have this guy, William Wickham. He was a magistrate, and a magistrate, I guess, is like a judge at this time. So it wasn't cops. There was no cops, FBI, CIA, none of that stuff. So William Wickham was basically assigned to keep track of people coming and going out of France or those areas. And he was in Geneva, I believe, around that area, Switzerland, around that area, or Flem, whatever, where the Flemish are from. And so he was around that area. So in 1792, he meets with the Girondists. And the Girondists, they were one faction within the French Revolution. 1792, you have this guy, George Lyman. He starts reporting on this London Corresponding Society. And by correspondence, they were corresponding about political ideas. And so this was very radical at the time. They wanted universal male suffrage. All the men in England could vote, right? And so they were corresponding with people in France, with people all over Europe, because a lot of these men who were at that time, middle class, lower class, the bourgeoisie, had this idea that they were ready to take power for themselves. And it was vague. It was vague for them and for lower class people who that included. So 1794, we have in France, Anthony du Rovere, who was a British agent, okay? So he's working for England, for Britain, and he makes contacts with the Naval Department and the Committee of Public Safety, which was the revolutionary governing body during the Revolution, in the French Revolution. So now these English are actively infiltrating, but it's not an official role yet. It's not the FBI, the cops, whatever. So 1794, again, information provided by informants leads to the mass arrest of members of the corresponding society. So now they're infiltrating, the English government is infiltrating France, and they're infiltrating in England to crush down all this talk of all the men being able to vote, democracy, right, an end to the feudal order. This is what they're trying to stop. 1795, William Wickham, the magistrate who was spying on revolutionaries coming and going from France, he has intelligence networks set up in France to subvert the military capacity of the French Revolution. So England is actively trying to undermine the French Revolution, just like over 100 years later, the U.S. was trying to actively undermine the Bolshevik Revolution and the Russian Revolution. So 1797, okay, now we're in Ireland. So you see, at the start, infiltration of the left was about the French Revolution and the Irish. Now, the other big problem was slavery, but that was separate because monitoring and infiltrating slave networks and relationships, that was the responsibility of the plantation and the overseer, right? So these functions are going to merge later on. So Dublin Castle in Ireland was receiving intelligence from informers and about a small number of deep penetration agents. So there's already in 1797 there was a problem with Irish independence. We know as leftists, the most famous example of that is going to be the IRA in the 70s and 80s. So already back then, you see revolutionary politics, right? And the Irish, okay? And separately, although we're not covering that as much here, slavery, but that was mostly about inducing the slaves to inform on each other because there was constant slave revolts as well. So then, 1797 in UK. So still during the time of the French Revolution, an unnamed man visits this guy, Lord Downshire, and confesses that he's been plotting on insurrection with this group called the United Irishmen. And the United Irishmen, there were some former British soldiers who decided they wanted to apply their military knowledge to get independence for Ireland. And so he basically turns himself in and wants to work for the British. And he says these insurrectionaries, they want a violent overthrow of the existing government. So again, revolutionary politics, infiltration. And this man had started out merely wanting parliamentary reform, but then he was seduced into revolutionary intrigue. So you see, it starts out a little bit of reform, and then we go to revolution. Okay. 1798, Wickham, the magistrate now, focuses intelligence on gathering efforts on the United Irishmen in Dublin, Habsburg, and Paris. So all of these revolutionary Irish people, they're seeing the French Revolution. The middle class in England is seeing the French Revolution. They have all these revolutionary ideas before communism, socialism, anarchism, before Karl Marx, right? But it's going to lead to that. And I want to stop here and just see what we have so far, right? It's these ideas that come out of the bourgeoisie taking power against the feudal order, right? That's what happens. And these ideas now, they're not just for the bourgeoisie, because when the bourgeoisie said everybody should be equal, well, then, of course, slaves in Haiti, they're like, well, fuck yeah, we're equal too. And they killed their slave masters, right? Women are going to start saying, in the French Revolution already, Olympe de Gouges was saying, well, women deserve equal rights too. So already now, from ancient times up to 1798, basically 1800, we're seeing that infiltration is a feature of class society. And we're also seeing that sometimes it's the government, the authorities themselves, going to infiltrate and monitoring populations. And then sometimes it's these guys turning themselves in, like this unnamed man who visits Lord Downshire. Now, the last thing I'm going to tell you about this period, 1800s, that was the first, what they call combination acts, the first union-busting legislation. Combinations were groups of workers that formed together, what we would now call unions, basically. So at this time, 1700s, right? In America, we learn this in school. It's the Constitution and the founding slave masters and all this stuff about American freedom. But we see even then, the American slave masters, our founding slave masters, they were really talking about using all of these ideas of bourgeois liberation for themselves and excluding everybody else. But that's why they couldn't stop it, and still today they can't stop it. So in our next installment, we'll get into the 1800s. That's when shit starts going crazy. You see, in the 1830s, that's when people start actively fighting against the bourgeoisie. And when we actively start fighting against the bourgeois creates all these bureaucratic institutions to infiltrate us and break us. Okay, guys. That's part two of Brother Theater's Timeline of Infiltration. I hope you got something out of it. Feel free to leave comments, like and subscribe. If you want to donate, Cash App, DMT79. Oh, I love you. Solidarity comments.